You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 6th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of The Briefing, broadcasting live from Washington, D.C. I'm Chris Chermak.
And I'm Carlotta Rebello. Coming up on today's program.
Many people have told me that God spared my life for a reason. And that reason was to save our country and to restore America to greatness.
Donald Trump is projected to win the U.S. presidential election by a surprisingly wide margin over Kamala Harris. We'll look back on the night that was here in Washington, D.C., get the Republican reaction, and then...
I personally believe that authoritarian regimes are building the capacity to fight against different democracy all over the world. And if U.S. will have some issues with elections, then bad guys will use that against us, all of us.
We'll also have a look at how the world has digested the news of a second Trump term, from Ukraine to Japan, Bangkok and Paris, and then back to London too.
All that and more coming up right here on The Briefing, live from Washington, D.C. This is a special edition of The Briefing, live from Washington. In the early hours of this morning, Republican Donald Trump was projected the winner of the U.S. presidential race, defeating Democrat Kamala Harris and becoming just the second U.S. president ever to be elected for a second non-consecutive term in office.
We're joined first of all by Megan Vasquez, who's a breaking news political reporter for The Washington Post. Megan, great having you join us today. Now, we know that election nights are never straightforward, but take us through what this night was like for a breaking news reporter.
Yes, good morning from Washington. I have to tell you, this feels like one of the most dramatic political arcs in history here in the United States, and what we expected to be a multi-night situation became quickly realized over the course of the evening and into the morning here. Between the hours of, I would say, somewhere around 9 o'clock up until about 3 in the morning, we were getting state after state, these battlegrounds, and Pennsylvania was called for Donald Trump, and therefore narrowing the opportunity for Vice President Kamala Harris to win victory. And soon it became clear that there were not enough electoral college votes for her to win. So it was quicker than I think many in Washington anticipated, given the way that 2020 took place.
Megan, it certainly was quicker than so many would have expected for this race. Was there a moment that it became particularly clear to you, I guess, on this night, that it was not only headed to a victory for Donald Trump, but really that this was going to be one that was well beyond the narrow margins that basically all the polls had predicted?
Right. I think it was sort of like a one-state situation, right? North Carolina was quickly decided, which hadn't been decided for several days in 2020. Then came Georgia, which Donald Trump was not able to get in 2020. And then, of course, Pennsylvania, which is consequential in order for Kamala Harris to have been able to win. So I would say it was around the time that Pennsylvania was called by multiple different election outlets that it really crystallized.
And why didn't Kamala Harris break through? Was it simply not enough time for people to get to know her, or something else?
Well, I think that there's a number of factors that you need to consider. The first of which is the fact that she was attempting to run in the shadow of two former presidents, essentially, right? Like, you have President Biden, who decides not to run for another term, whose shadow she's running in. So it's that's one big quandary to have to deal with. The other one is, having to be able to define her own message, right? There were at times moments where she was saying, I don't know, basically saying I couldn't think of a way that I would run differently than Joe Biden. So in the course of a very short campaign, not being able to define that messaging for herself definitely wasn't enough to set her apart from a president who had really low approval ratings and was not doing well in the polls when he decided to drop out. And in addition, there are the headwinds of the economy and immigration, which on messaging-wise, Donald Trump was really being able to pull through on. And the economy, as we know, is one of the recurring themes that we see in American elections each 4 years, well, really more than each 4 years, in what voters are most concerned about. It's almost always one of the top reasons that are motivating someone's vote.
Megan, as you say, I think Kamala Harris struggled to define herself, but that was also arguably because Democrats and Harris focused this kind of intentionally also on Donald Trump and what he would bring to this country. It was sort of almost both sides were leaning into this idea of Donald Trump and what he would bring to the country. Do we think, or do we realize from this election, I suppose, that his brand is actually stronger and more durable than both sides expected?
Yes, absolutely. That's such a wonderful point. Donald Trump, for almost a decade at this point, has become a political lightning rod in terms of what gets talked about on in the national press, right? And so when we're talking about the Donald Trump brand, right, I think we're trying to navigate what that means for certain voters. And I think what you're saying is absolutely correct in that there, especially in the summer as he emerged victorious at the Republican National Convention, having been through an assassination attempt, ordered an assassination attempt, you know, we're at a point where I think we're seeing this Trump brand evolve into something else for not just the voters who are diehards for him, right, but understanding how the things that he's gone through, this crazy arc of an election, how American voters see that. And whether or not, you know, you believe that he shouldn't be holding elected office or whether you voted for him or not, you know, there's a certain staying power that it just defies all conventions of politics in the United States in modern day.
And just finally, Megan, if you could update us briefly, I know there would be a lot to get through, but the latest on the congressional races. The Senate, we know, has been projected for Republicans. Could they still gain full control by winning the House of Representatives as well?
Right. So that is a big question mark that has yet to be resolved. And so there are several different House races that remain unresolved. And that's honestly what I'll be watching today because I don't know what's going to happen.
The race is far from over. Megan Vasquez from the Washington Post there. Thanks for joining us. And for the latest on the election and to follow Megan's work, head over to the Washington Post live updated feed.
Now, Carlotta, we wanted to step back a little bit at this point in the show, early in this show, and look at how the night unfolded for us, because I did feel a lot of what Megan was talking about there, the moments when Pennsylvania was called. That was live on our show while we were doing The Globalist earlier today. I was at a watch party of election observers earlier in the night. We'll have more on that later. You were at a watch party of some of the Democrats that turned glum as the night continued.
Yes, there was definitely a shift in mood as the night progressed. It was very vibrant and happy and hopeful at the beginning, but it became clear at some point that things were not going according to plan. You know, being here in Washington, D.C., we know it is a Democratic, stronghold, and it was a great experience to be at this watch party by the DC's Democratic Party and meet some of the people, some of the volunteers, members of the public, and others. But yes, I fear there's a lot of sore heads this morning.
Well, and speaking of sore heads, I think it's interesting that, I went out at about 4:30 this morning into the streets of Washington, D.C., and just by the White House and saw the police basically packing up, which I think was surprising in itself, because yesterday we were talking also on these shows about the prospects of violence. There were the shops boarded up. What do you make of that? Clearly it's been quieter. I guess people are just, Washington's a democratic city, right? So they're kind of depressed.
Well, I want to believe that's been being overcautious and taking too many precautions than actually credible threats of violence. I feel like a lot of businesses are trying to save-proof and ensure that there's no damage to their own property. And, the day is still very young here in Washington, D.C. We're just 10 minutes past 7 a.m. Local time. And we will discover how the city has woken up this morning in what's to come. But also out and about were our own colleagues, Monocle's US editor Chris Lord and Sam Impey.
They were indeed also out and about last night, collecting voices from the lone Republican watch party in this heavily Democratic U.S. Capitol. Here's some of what they heard.
I don't support Donald Trump. I don't like him. I think he is an awful person. However, I like him more than Kamala Harris. So it's a lesser of two evils. I feel like there's two choices. Orange man bad, people being angry over nothingness, or an ineffective presidency with Biden and Harris over the last 4 years where our economy sucks. Afghanistan was terrible, the border was terrible, etc.
What brought me out tonight is I really like President Trump, and this is a super important election, and I'm super conservative, and so for the past 4 years, there's been a lot of things that I've seen. I live in Philly. With COVID and everything, it was terrible in my city. There was looting and rioting, and with all of that, it was just really awful. Just like not having, I feel like the political adversity has just become like crazy, and it's not really like you can respectfully disagree anymore, so I feel like that definitely has to change.
I do believe that maybe in the future, with politicians that have been in power for less time, people who are less in the political atmosphere like Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, you may see a resurgence of enthusiasm for young people. As for now, I do think a lot of young people look at Donald Trump and Kamala Harris and they think this is just more of the same.
Yeah, I just think people are generally jaded and they don't trust the institutions that used to, look out for their best interests. So I think they've just, with like youthful ambivalence and in addition to jadedness, I think that's kind of what explains the disengagement there.
A few thoughts there from a few Trump voters last night. This is the briefing on Monocle Radio coming to you from Washington, D.C. Ever since 2016, Donald Trump has remade the Republican Party and its platform in his own image, driving out traditional conservatives and bringing in a new cast of MAGA Republicans who will no doubt be even more emboldened by a second Trump term.
And for a look at how this Republican tent has been reformed, we're joined now by Linda Chavez, former White House advisor to President Ronald Reagan. Linda, great to have you on the show for this morning to help us unpack what's just happened. But I will ask you a simple question to begin with. Is this still the party of Ronald Reagan?
No, it is not. And I don't think it ever will be again. It is now the party of Donald Trump. He has transformed the party, and apparently a majority of Americans like that transformation.
Why is that in your mind? What is it about the people that are voting now for Donald Trump? Is it the same people? It's interesting, when I would speak to Trump voters before this as well, you did still have a mix of sort of establishment Republicans and the new MAGA Republicans. Is that something that has surprised you as well?
Well, I think there are some establishment Republicans who were very dissatisfied with the Biden administration, and in particular with what they thought was not a good handling of the economy. They believed that the Biden administration passed expensive legislation that flushed money into the system, and that happened to help fuel inflation. So I think that was the response from the establishment Republicans. But this is now a populist movement. And it's a populist movement like we have seen elsewhere around the world, in places like Hungary, in places like Italy, and even in Great Britain. And I think that populism really was a very, very fertile ground for a candidate like Donald Trump, who frankly is known mostly as a celebrity. I call it the tabloidization of politics. And I think it paid off. He got a lot of people who don't normally vote to vote. He won a very large portion of Hispanic votes, for example. I wrote a book in 1991 about Hispanics in the Republican Party, predicting that, in fact, Hispanics were natural Republicans, and Donald Trump was able to tap into that.
Now, of course, that populism that you described there also has made some long-life Republicans shun away from the party. And this leaves the question about what kind of people are we expecting Donald Trump to appoint to his cabinet in this second term? Who can we expect to see alongside him? Because we know from the first time around, a lot of those names are not viable anymore.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's one of the things that frankly surprised me about the reaction of the American people. And I think it's largely because most average Americans don't follow politics the way people who listen to this program do, the way I have done. And I think they're largely unaware that so many in Donald Trump's administration shunned him afterwards, considered him a threat, and said he should get nowhere near the Oval Office. But that message for many Americans, I think it just either they didn't hear it or it didn't resonate. So I think the kind of people that we're going to see in a Trump administration are going to be relatively inexperienced. They are going to be much more radically right than his first group of appointees. And then we'll see what happens, at least at the cabinet and sub-cabinet level, where you need Senate confirmation, whether or not there will be pushback. But he is perfectly capable of basically ignoring the Constitution and the requirement for Senate confirmation. He could do a series of appointments that were done during a recess of Congress that would give people the power to be in those positions for a certain period of time before they had to be confirmed. So I think we're going to see a real upheaval in the way in which this new Trump administration staffs its various offices.
Linda, to that point of Senate confirmation, I mean, the Senate has already flipped to Republicans, and they've done surprisingly well there as well. Maybe not enough to always get through Senate confirmations, although we also don't know what kind of rules the Republicans might consider changing or what kind of pressure Trump would put on Republicans to change the rules to get everything through with 50 votes. We don't know about the House yet either, but there is a good chance that Donald Trump will hold the White House and Republicans will have both houses of Congress. What would that kind of total control mean?
Well, it will be very important in terms of passing legislation. And you're quite right that the only thing that prevents the president from being able to get his way if he has a majority in both houses of Congress is that there are rules in the Senate that allow for a filibuster. Those rules have been modified in my lifetime. It used to be a filibuster meant just that. Someone had to get on the floor of the U.S. Senate and they had to speak nonstop. And that would prevent a vote from taking place. But that doesn't happen anymore. And, it has been the Democrats who have been arguing to get rid of the filibuster. I think you'll see a lot of Republicans wanting to get rid of the 60 vote requirement as well. And again, that'll be more populism. That'll be more movement in a direction that allows broad public opinion to control politics rather than sort of the more measured system that was put in place by America's founding fathers.
Linda Chavez, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio.
You're back with a briefing on Monocle Radio. It's time now to turn to global reaction, and we're going to start with our Asia editor, James Chambers in Bangkok. James, great to have you with us. I guess there's only one obvious place to start with you. Thai sensation Mudang, the baby hippo that took the world by storm, actually predicted a Trump win.
I was going to say, Carlotta, we already knew the news yesterday because, as you said, the cutest pygmy hippo in the world ate a pumpkin with Donald Trump's name on it in Thai. And lo and behold, Trump wins. So I think Mudang Mania is just going to hit the roof now, and he's now going to be consulted on all things 2025.
Mudang will absolutely hit the roof. Will other people in Bangkok and Southeast Asia hit the roof as well? How will they greet this news?
Well, I mean, for now, in Asia, this has been very much US entertainment. I mean, no one does drama quite like the Americans. And actually, this has all been unfolding in the Asian time zone. So most people who are interested in this type of thing will have been kind of gripped to the TV and to their phones, watching it all unfold. And unfortunately for you guys, you've been up all night. But here it's been breaking in our daytime, and so we've been glued to the story. So it's been a very friendly story for us to follow. And actually, in places like China, where they don't have the chance to vote in elections like this, people there have been able to kind of watch this happen on their screens. It hasn't been censored, and they've been gripped to it because they don't know what an election is like, and what's been going on in America makes for fascinating viewing.
Now, we know that the relationship with Donald Trump from his previous time in office is not always the easiest. How does it stand in that part of the world? Does Trump have any allies in Southeast Asia? What does this future relationship with the region look like?
Yeah, it's hard to talk about allies with Donald Trump. I guess he has bros and people he likes doing business with. And actually, when you think about Donald Trump and you think about the types of policies he stands for, he'd go down very well in Asia. He's a nationalist. He loves tariffs and protectionism. He's tough on immigration. He's kind of very conservative, at least what he says in public about things like abortion. And so I imagine if he stood for election in this part of the world, he'd probably do far better than Kamala Harris would do with her progressive policies. And as we saw in the past, he has been able to, kind of have these relationships with some of these big strongmen leaders in this part of the world, like Xi Jinping and like the North Korean leader, and so I'm sure he's going to do a similar thing. We have the new Indonesian president Prabowo, who was he's a similar age. He's got a similarly sketchy background, and at the moment he's been kind of hobnobbing it with Russia. So I imagine Donald Trump might strike up a friendship with him too. So I imagine he might actually get on a lot better with a lot of the leaders out here, where where things like democracy aren't held up in as high regard as we thought they were in America.
Monocle's Asia editor James Chambers there on the line from Bangkok. Thanks for joining us on The Briefing.
Now, if there is one country that may have the most to lose from the election of Donald Trump, it might be Ukraine. And so we'll turn to reaction from there next. We're joined down the line by Lily Bivings, business editor of the Kyiv Independent. Lily, great to have you on the show. As an American in Ukraine, what has your reaction been over there?
My personal reaction, and thanks for having me on, my personal reaction is, not surprised, but still, slightly devastated that this is happening. because of what it means for Ukraine. And as an American who's lived in Ukraine for many years and works in journalism and works to get the message out about Ukraine and its fight against Russia's invasion, it's very worrying for me as an American. And I have to say, totally honestly, I'm a bit embarrassed to be an American in Ukraine and to feel somehow that I have let Ukraine down, or the country that I'm from has let Ukraine down. However, we don't exactly know what will happen, right? But that's the anxiety that I feel today on a personal level.
We certainly don't know what will happen, but Volodymyr Zelensky, the president, has also reacted already to the news. Tell us about what he said.
So, I think in congratulating Trump quickly, which he did, it's a way of reaching out to someone that he does not have the best relationship with, as you remember, or, as I'm sure everyone knows, right? It was the fateful phone call with Zelensky that led to Donald Trump's first impeachment. And so you can imagine that Donald Trump may not be super interested in a close relationship with Zelensky, or may not view him in the most favorable light. And then in one of their recent visits, Donald Trump said that he had a great relationship with both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. And Zelensky sort of quickly responded saying, well, I hope our relationship is better, right? So I think reaching out, congratulating him and wanting to forge a positive relationship with the new president is going to be key for continued support to Ukraine. That would be my take.
Lily, we wanted to play you a clip of a Ukrainian Trump voter that we spoke to here in DC last night. Let's have a listen.
I come from a Ukrainian single-parent household, so it is really close to heart, and I think it comes down to we need to be an example. Right now, we're really divided. Right now, we are throwing out insults, and I think it's really important for us to be an example for a country that's been torn, that's been in turmoil for centuries, and standing for what we believe and showing it in practice in a ethical way is something that I hope that Trump will do in his 4 years.
What's your reaction to that?
It's interesting, to hear it through this lens of division and to compare the division that exists in the United States politically and in Ukraine. I think it's probably a false equivalency. I don't think the divisions that exist in Ukrainian society are the same, certainly. And I don't think that division, if we speak of political divisions or maybe ethnic divisions in Ukraine, are the result or the cause, rather, of the war in Ukraine, if that's what the person was referring to. But I have been thinking a lot about this because throughout our coverage of the U.S. elections at the Kyiv Independent, and while I am the business editor, I was actually in charge of our U.S. coverage. So, and not because I'm American, I don't think, but that was my role these last several months. And there were several themes that came up. But when we spoke to Ukrainian Americans, those who have been there for many generations, or those who are newcomers to Ukraine, many of them feel that, actually the Democrats, not just the Biden administration, have not done enough for Ukraine. So going back to Obama not responding forcefully enough to Russia's first invasion in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, refusing to give lethal weaponry to Ukraine, not sanctioning Russia intensely enough. And then, the full-scale invasion happening underneath the Democratic administration. I think a lot of people feel like, well, this seems to be something that the Democrats can't handle. And maybe Trump and the Republican Party, they're the ones who actually can deal with this crisis, that actually can, solve the division perhaps between Russia and Ukraine, if that's what the person was talking about. I'm very skeptical of that, but I understand where it comes from. Of course, you have historical reasons why Ukrainian Americans, especially those who've been there for a while and left after the fall of the Soviet Union, who feel strongly about communism and things like that. They view Democrats sometimes within this leftist communist light. But it kind of makes sense, right? If you've been seeing this happen to your country for 10 years and the Democrats haven't seemed to solve it, then why not take your chance on the other party and see what they can do So it's not something I personally agree with, but it's something I understand.
Lily Bivings of the Kyiv Independent, thank you very much for joining us from Kyiv. Now, for more from Ukraine, earlier in the night I joined an election watch party of foreign election observers who had been invited to Washington by the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And while there, I spoke with Ola Ivazovska of the Ukrainian election organization Opora, which was founded after Ukraine's Orange Revolution some 2 decades ago.
We are working on post-war elections already. We have working groups in the parliament, working groups in the Central Election Commission, Ukrainian civil society organization as Opora, trying to collect the experience all over the world, especially from those countries who had experience of post-war elections or post-conflict elections, because we need to protect the Ukrainian society and actors who will be involved in electoral processes from these challenges as, foreign interference, physical insecurity, cyber attacks, and so on and so forth. And the U.S. elections is super important and interesting for Ukraine because of political landscape, because of the U.S. support of Ukraine during wartime, and because of your experience to be one of the eldest democracy in the world. The most important is to win the narratives, not to fight with each and everyone who are spreading the fake news, because it's about news, and news do not live in a long period, but narratives are very, very dangerous. That's why the most important to find the sources of those narratives and to work against them. We have to collaborate between democracies, but Ukraine now is the most capable to fight with narratives. We have many problems for sure. Many people do not accept the truth about this war, or how Russia is dangerous and China and Iran and others are dangerous for democracies, but still we are not losing this informational war for sure. This means that we're still fighting and defending our rights to be independent and democratic state. I personally believe that authoritarian regimes are building the capacity to fight against different democracy all over the world. And if US will have some issues with elections, then bad guys will use that against us, all of us. And the price of the weaknesses of democracy here will be very high for everyone all over the world. All of us will be weaker, and authoritarian regime will increase their power all over the world. It's not direct fight between the state, but it's indirect, because foreign interference, Russian interference, Chinese interference are very, very visible everywhere. And they will use it against us, all of us.
That was the Ukrainian election observer Ola Ivazovska. This is The Briefing live from Washington. We'll be right back. Let's turn now to the country whose leader was among the first to greet Donald Trump's election back in 2016. That, of course, was Shinzo Abe of Japan. Japan now has a new leader as well, and for more on the country's reaction to Donald Trump's election, we're joined by Fiona Wilson, Monocle's senior Asia editor and Tokyo bureau chief. Fiona, your first reactions?
I think surprise, probably the first reaction. I think, obviously Japan is ready to work with, they were ready to work with whoever won. The alliance is so important. Japan, the US, that strategic partnership is absolutely critical for Asian security. And I think they've been saying for a long time now that they're ready for whoever would win. And they'd already been courting both sides. They'd been meeting with Donald Trump via the embassy. They'd been meeting with Kamala Harris's team as well. So I think they were ready for whoever would win. But I think, just the way the polls were going, they probably thought that it was going to be a Harris government. So, I sense there will be a little bit of a surprise.
And Fiona, there is a pragmatism, I suppose, with the Japanese government, also from that first time around. Do we imagine that Trump has any sort of goodwill towards Japan, given that first time around in 2016, or are we sort of back to square one?
Yeah, I think, there's obviously the reality is, yes, you had the Trump whisperer, Shinzo Abe, who was prime minister at the time, and he apparently had this great relationship with Trump. I never really know how great it was, but that was often spoken of, and that that people would say Abe, got Trump. He understood him. He did a good job for, getting Japan's case across. I think there'll be a certain amount of, alarm. There's a feeling that it's a kind of transactional diplomacy where Trump is concerned. There are a lot of issues for Japan. You've got the security issue, obviously, massive, but there's also the economy. And I think there's a strong feeling that if Trump comes down hard on China, which he has already said he will with these really heavy tariffs, and he's also said he'll be putting tariffs on all foreign imports, but particularly on China, that impacts the Japanese economy and it impacts the wider regional economy. China is Japan's biggest trading partner. So there's that aspect to it as well. But yes, there's also the security angle. For Japan, it's very, very important that it has this strong relationship with the US. It's hosting 50-odd thousand US military personnel in Japan. It has this huge agreement to pay for that. And I don't know if you remember, the previous administration, Trump started raising, the question of Japan paying much more to host those troops. Now, in the meantime, Japan is now aiming for a 2% of GDP spend on its military budget. So that's a massive increase. So that's happened since Trump wasn't in office. But, you've got so many issues, whether it's North Korea, climate change, relationship with all the regional countries, which, can be fractious. And America, a stable America is very, very important for that.
And Fiona, one of the things about Trump's first administration was at least that throughout an initial period, he was surrounded by, officials and advisors who understood Japan and knew what they were doing. There's concerns if that will be the same level that we're going to see now on a second Trump administration, if you consider how many people have distanced themselves of Trump since then. Is that at all in the radar of the Japanese government about concerns of how this future relationship might take shape?
I mean, definitely, Carlotta, it's such a good point. I think that's a big concern for Japan. Now, they know Senator Bill Hegarty, who served as ambassador here 2017 to 2019. But really, it's kind of a blank slate. They don't know who will be dealing with Asia from Trump's administration. So it is a question. It would also potentially have been a slight question with Kamala Harris, because she was not known to be, or rather she was known not to be a foreign policy person. But I think there was a sense that it would be continuity with her. I think what you've got at the moment is it's not clear who will be filling these roles. So they don't really know the team they'll be working with. And of course, relationships are so important in diplomacy. So yeah, there's a certain concern. I think there's a slight worry as well about the previous time when Trump was president. He went a bit rogue on some of these big issues. He went to meet Kim Jong-un and he was very, there was a lot of bravado. I can talk to this guy. Of course, it turned out it made no difference in the long run anyway, but it was certainly a photo opportunity. But I think Japan would like to be kept on board. They feel they've got this close relationship with the US, but they're probably a little bit concerned that from Trump's point of view, he's looking at more as a transactional relationship. What can he get out of it for the US? Obviously, trade's going to be a top of that list.
Monocle's Fiona Wilson in Tokyo there. Thanks for joining us on The Briefing. Now, back in the European continent, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron were quick to showcase a united front in the face of a second Trump term. Let's get the latest on this with Monocle's foreign editor, Alexis Self. He joins us from London, and also with our Paris bureau chief, Simon Bouvier, who's on the line from the French capital.
Good afternoon to you both. Simon, let's start with you. The French President Macron has notoriously had a sort of love-hate relationship with Trump. I'm reminded of the handshake moment they had in that first term. It's interesting that he came together with Scholz very quickly today. What did you make of the morning so far?
Good morning, Chris. Well, I think that he reacted the only way that he could react, by kind of accepting the reality that he's going to have to deal with him for another 4 years. And, it's funny you mentioned that handshake moment, the kind of famous Trump dusting off the dandruff or imaginary dandruff from his shoulder. This kind of condescension is something that Macron can expect to continue now that Trump has won again. But it's really coming at a bad moment because of all of the security concerns that Europe has with Ukraine, of course, and coming at a time when the European economy is not in great shape. And he personally is in a position of weakness compared to Trump's previous term, where domestically he's having to deal with a lot of issues. He's essentially sidelined. And as you know very well, I think in Germany, Scholz is not in a much stronger position himself. So I don't think anybody in the European capitals is happy about this result.
Lex, to bring you in here, in this statement, Scholz and Macron pledge a more united and stronger Europe. Will this mean anything different in practice than what's in place now?
Good afternoon, guys. Yes, I think the first Trump term awoke in the European capitals this idea or this sentiment that Europe had to start thinking more about its own security and become less reliant on US guarantees of security. I think, and it did have an effect. These debates, this idea of European strategic autonomy that is taken for granted now, I would say, across most of the EU, was as a consequence of Trump's first term and then obviously Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think efforts to get that in place, to increase defence spending, will be made now. And certainly in the UK, I'm here in London, that's been a big part of Labour's rhetoric, as it has in Berlin and Paris. But I think perhaps it hasn't been followed through on decisively. One would hope that would happen now.
Simon, what's interesting here for me is, on the one hand, as Lex talks about this need for Europe to unite and get stronger on its own defense, but I did speak to some officials here in Washington before this election who kind of warned Europe not to overreact to this, kind of trying to make that point that this is still only going to be 4 years. Do not turn your back on the United States completely as a result of this. Do we expect Europeans to heed that call?
I think so. I don't think they have a choice. I think they have to continue hoping that America will kind of return to the multilateralist fold. But in the meantime, they also, as Lex was saying, they also have to get moving on collective security. And the reality is that the rhetoric has changed quite a bit, especially in Germany, where we've seen kind of announcements for massive investments in defense, which was a taboo until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the reality is that political fragility within, France and Germany specifically, who are the two kind of biggest decision-making centers for the whole of these kind of as of yet theoretical EU collective security agreements, is going to make it extremely difficult for them to land on anything. And one example is that for now, a lot of the money that they're spending to support the Ukrainians is spent to purchase American equipment for Ukrainians instead of bolstering kind of the domestic EU defense industry. I think without a strong local defense industry, they won't be able to kind of consolidate and build this European security that has been a dream of Macron's for a long time. But the reality is that it's going to be very complicated to build because the consensus just isn't there right now. They have all of these other distractions and competing domestic priorities that are kind of preventing this consensus from happening.
And Lex, earlier in the program, we heard from Republican strategist Linda Chavez, and she was talking about, how the Republican Party of Trump is a populist movement and has those undertones. Will this re-election embolden similar movements in Europe, particularly as we've seen like we saw the first time around? Are there any particular countries or movements that might see a swing towards the far right off the back of this election?
Well, among all of the congratulatory tweets from European leaders, perhaps the one that we can genuinely believe is that of Viktor Orban, who suddenly goes from pariah among his European neighbours to potentially, a very useful and important bridge between the United States and Europe. There's also Robert Fico in Slovakia, who has a similar kind of far-right nationalist agenda. I think, and Giorgia Meloni in Italy as well, who is of the Trump cohort in terms of Western leaders at the moment. I think they'll become increasingly important. We were talking a lot about Macron and Scholz. Macron has a few more years in power, but he's become a bit of a lame duck since calling those ill-timed parliamentary elections earlier this year. And Scholz, I can't see Scholz continuing much beyond next year as Chancellor, perhaps before then. So we are seeing a shift. I think hopefully European leaders and the EU will have learned from the first Trump term. And as I said, You mentioned this rhetoric about strategic autonomy. I think it takes time. It takes time to get these things in place, for defense spending to translate into, material benefits. And then, of course, there is the effort, which will be, I think, hastened by yesterday's election to, build Europe's manufacturing base so that it can face the threat of a kind of fracturing geopolitical order and a resurgent Russia. And China, I think China is very important. I think Europe has to decide how it approaches China now, whether it goes along with Trump's, anti-China trade policy or it develops its own one. That's a decision that has to be made in Brussels and London to a lesser extent, how Europe responds to China now.
Simon Bouvier in Paris and Alexis Self in London. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, Carlotta, just before we go, we are here in Washington, D.C. for another couple of days, living in this new reality that we now live in. What are you looking to learn over the next couple of days?
Chris, if I'm honest, I can't really think beyond sleep at this point. But actually, I was just thinking earlier how one missing element compared to the first time around, or the last time that Trump ran, from his campaign was the presence and the prominence of his family, in particular his wife. And I'm quite curious to see what this second term will mean for the new old First Lady, because it's always quite an interesting thing to see what each First Lady decides to do with the office, and considering how much of a step back she had taken throughout this campaign, I wonder what that actually might translate. But I'll turn the question to you. What are you looking to learn in the next coming days?
Well, I think I'm looking at just how not only emboldened Donald Trump is going to be from this, but I think one of the most interesting questions for me is going to be what he does with that exactly. We just don't know still how unpredictable he's going to be, and to be frank, how involved he is going to be, I think, is a question. Is he going to be wanting to be involved very deeply on policy in the White House, in picking his cabinet, picking the people? Is he going to pick people that kind of run things for him? Or is he going to be a figurehead in that sense now that he's in office? Or is he going to take a deep role in this entire operation once he gets back in? That's going to be the biggest question for me.
I think we wouldn't be surprised if we started seeing, as first order of business, those who dared speak against him over the past campaign to somehow be told so. Well, we'll have more, of course, on the US election as analysis and results continue to come in. And that's all for this special edition of The Briefing, coming to you from Washington, D.C.
The program was produced by Carlotta Ribello. Our sound engineers were Sam Impey here in DC and Flynn Simons back in London.
The Briefing is back at the same time tomorrow, and we will be back a bit later with the Monocle Daily live from Washington as we continue to unpack the results of last night's election and what a second Trump term might actually look like. I'm Carlotta Ribello.
And I'm Chris Chermak. Hope you've enjoyed the show. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.